To start off my message this morning, I just want to ask you if you have an idea what that is. What do you reckon that represents? How about that? What does that represent? How about that? Here's what it represents for me this morning. Our journey of spiritual growth. That's our journey of spiritual growth, or that's what it represents. You know, if you're honest with yourself, certainly looks like mine. You know, it goes up. We have moments of, growth, and then we go downwards. We flatline sometimes, or and it's going to be different for everyone. One of the things that struck me in the last few years was that when I thought about my journey with God for many, many years, and this was for decades, probably up until the last sort of 4 or 5 years. I used to see my journey in God in terms of my gifting or doing certain things for God. Now, that may not be like that for everyone. It was because back, it must have been 1993, a year after I was saved, I felt God calling me to be involved. Specifically, I felt called to go to Bible college. I didn't know where that would lead. So, not everyone feels that to dedicate their life to serving God in that way. But for me, it didn't. And so, but I often thought about my journey with God and my journey through life with God as doing things, like preaching or being involved in church ministry. And I had a love-hate relationship with it. On one hand, I felt this need to do something for God, but on the other hand, I had all this brokenness, a lot of which people didn't see, or I tried to hide from people. Some of it I was just deceived about. And it never really went as smoothly as I wanted to. And I did pursue. We moved to the UK, I was involved in church, a lot of different things. I taught in a Bible college, and I, was involved in leadership in a church and ended up becoming a pastor over there and things like that. So, there was outworking of that. But it was always sort of a love-hate relationship, and I realized a number of years ago the outworking of my gifting was not the most important thing in the Christian life. That was not the most important thing. It was important to do the will of God and be obedient. But the most important thing was me being changed and transformed to be more like Jesus. That was the most important thing. And so what I then did for him would be sanctified. It would be purified. And so we can, in church life, do things for God, but if it's not sanctified, it actually doesn't help people. Sometimes it can actually damage people. Sometimes it just can have no effect. And so, regardless of what you feel called to, and I believe God calls everyone, it's just different callings. If you open up your heart, he will speak to your heart and say, I'm calling you to do something. That, whatever that calling is, to do something, it has to be sanctified by the transformation of your own life. And that journey, you could just talk it in terms of growth, spiritual growth. That is an up and down process. And the whole purpose of talking about the spiritual disciplines is to help us in that process of spiritual growth. Today, I'm going to be talking about the fourth spiritual discipline, and I'm going to start by just reading out some scriptures just to introduce it. Luke chapter 6 verse 12 says this: during those days Jesus went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer to God. Matthew 14:13, when Jesus heard about it, he's talking about the when John the Baptist gets his head chopped off, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. Matthew 14:23, after dismissing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. Mark 1:35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, went out, and made his way to a deserted place, and there he was praying. Luke 5:15-16, but the news about Jesus spread even more, and large crowds would come together to hear him and be healed of their sicknesses. Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. If you haven't already worked it out, the spiritual disciplines I'm going to be talking about this morning is called silence and solitude. You can see there through all those texts, through the in the Gospels about Jesus' life, you see consistently this theme of Jesus leaving groups of people, leaving those people who he's with, and going out and being alone. And oftentimes, specifically in the text, it talks about him praying. And so this idea of going off by yourself to be with God is a discipline that Jesus practiced, and he is our example. And we also should practice it. Let me just describe for a moment what I think this spiritual discipline of solitude and silence is. It's a container for our revelation of God. What do I mean by that? Well, solitude and silence contains our prayer life and our Bible reading and our Bible meditation. It's a container in which those sit. Without solitude and silence, our prayer and meditation of God's word dissipates. It dissolves. It melts away. It evaporates. See, what happens is that we read the Bible and we pray. God speaks to us, revelation. But then 2 days later, we can't even remember what it was. We haven't yet even lived that out because we can't even remember it. What's happened? It's evaporated. It's dissipated. It's dissolved. What is it evaporated into? Well, it's evaporated into our own self-centered agendas and our idols. It's evaporated and melted away into our own anxiety, the vision of our own life. It's dissipated into our own desires. But when we go away and be alone with God and away from other things and away from people and away from the activity of the Word, and we're silent there with God, the revelation that He's given us has a chance to then sink into our heart. Solitude and silence is a container for our revelation from God and about God. Solitude is the intentional choosing to be away from others and the day-to-day locked-in patterns that our interactions with others create. That's what solitude is. So it's to be away. It's to be away from others. But it's also to be away from those, do you know those patterns that we have when we interact with others? The habits. Solitude frees us from distractions to examine and confront our own soul and place ourselves before God. Solitude separates us from and releases us from the grip of the things in life that have become our idols. Solitude can be frightening because it leaves us with only God to cling to. What are you holding on to instead of God? That's what an idol is. What are the idols in your heart? In other words, what do I need? I need this. I just need this. If I only had this, that's an idol. What is it in your life? If I only had that. What are you clinging to? When you remove yourself from your everyday life to be alone with God, you're separated from those things. So when you go away to God, you don't take this with you. You don't take your laptop. Right? You don't take a book. You could take the Bible. Absolutely. I'd encourage you to take your Bible. Don't take a book. Even if it's a Christian book, even if it's a theological book, don't take that. You're separating yourself. You're removing yourself from the things that you cling to instead of God. And that can be scary. It can be scary just to be alone with God. When you have nothing else to cling to but Him. That's what solitude is for. Solitude reveals Jesus as the healer of our soul. It's in that space when we're alone with God, we realize He is the answer. These other things, these other idols aren't the answer, whatever they are. And they're often different for all of us. Solitude enables us to increasingly hear and see God calling us out of living death into living life. You know, when you're alone with God, and truly separated, often God will reveal your idols to you. He will reveal them to you. As we discipline ourselves to be alone with God, increasingly we start to be able to hear and see Him. We hear Him. He gives us vision of our life living with God. He starts to give us a vision of what it means to live. He calls us out of living life in death, and because we're living, but we often can live in death, in other words, doing things that are destructive to our own life and others. And He gives us vision of what life is like living in life. While we've got people around us and distractions around us, we don't have the space. We don't have the ears to hear. We don't have the eyes to see those things. We need to separate ourselves from those things. solitude in community. That might seem like an oxymoron, a contradiction. If we are to live spiritual, meaningful lives with one another, we need to find the balance of togetherness and solitude. We cannot live a spiritual life alone or without solitude. What do I mean by that? Well, do you know, some of us, because of our more introverted nature, have no problem being alone. I'm like that. That doesn't mean that you're practicing solitude. That just means your temperament is one where you enjoy your own company, right? Some of you, more extroverted, find it very, very difficult to be alone. You want to be with people. But we need to recognize that that's not necessarily community either. We need solitude whether we're an introvert or an extrovert. And we need to be honest with ourselves. If I go away reading a theological book, that is not solitude. I'm not spending time with God. I'm providing more information for my brain. And probably for me to live more in deception because I think information is enough without doing it. But James says, if we're hearers of the word without doing the word, we deceive ourselves. Providing more information to our mind, it can be a good thing, but it's pointless unless we actually put it into practice. To live a spiritual life, regardless of whether we're introverted or extroverted, we have to find space for solitude. And also, we have to find space for togetherness. There's a great quote here from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Who's heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? So he was a Christian theologian and activist in the 1930s and 40s who he was a German guy, a German pastor, and he resisted the Nazi regime, and he ended up, I think it was in 1945, got killed by the Nazis. He was imprisoned, and then he was killed by the Nazis. But he wrote these words in his book, Life Together. Let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. The one who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings. And the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes within the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair. What is he saying? He's saying that sometimes some of us want community. And if we have community, if we have connection with one another without making space for solitude with God, then our life in community is just a void of words and feelings. It doesn't have any substance. On the opposite side, those who want to be alone and go, I just want to be alone with God, and they think, it's solitude. They think they're connecting with God, but actually they're just an introvert that wants to be away from people. The solitude with themselves ends up being just, self-infatuation. It's just self-indulgence. It's just giving in to your natural temperament. You need both community and you need solitude. And without solitude, whatever our natural personality is, without solitude, we become empty. We need both. Here's the center of our solitude. appears at the very center of our solitude. Psalm 46 verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. That's the center. God is the center of our solitude, not us. How do we know whether we're actually in solitude with God? Look at who's at the center. If it's you, it's not solitude. You're just by yourself. If it's you thinking about you, lamenting, frustrated, anxious, thinking about yourself, thinking about what you haven't got, who you're mad at, who you're frustrated with, that's not solitude. Solitude is where you go away to be with God and you put God at the center. That's solitude. That's the NIV version. Look at the CSB version. Stop fighting and know that I'm God. Isn't that interesting? Stop fighting. Solitude means going and giving up. Give up fighting. Fighting for yourself. Fighting what you want. Fighting for your rights. Fighting for your preferences. Fighting for your opinions. That word, stop fighting or be still, is the Hebrew word rafa. I don't know if I've pronounced that right. I just think of the tennis player, Rafa. What does it mean? Well, it means let go, release. The sense is to stop, discontinue, or put to an end. The implication then is to be still and know that I am God, or stop fighting and know that I'm God, is that it is to go into solitude and stop putting yourself in the middle. Stop fighting for your own life. Stop trying to make it happen. Stop trying to overcome in your own strength. It is literally to come into solitude and just be with God. Allow Him to be with God. Let go of all those other things. Most of all, let go of those idols that you're clinging to. That we all have them. We all have idols. Release your life into the Lord's hands. That is true solitude. In that space, that's where God can start to reveal to you revelation in a deep level of your soul. In that place, you can become open, hearing God, for God to point out those things in your life that really need to change. In that place, you can start to see those things that maybe other people see, but you cannot see about yourself. The things that we do which are sinful. Things that block us from engaging with God. It is in that place of solitude where God is in the middle. So solitude frees us from the distractions to examine and confront our own soul and place ourselves before God. Here's a question. What are your distractions? How do you distract yourself? We all have things that we use to distract ourselves. TV, mobile phone, YouTube, games, sport, activity, DIY, pornography. There's a whole bunch of distractions. Shopping. There's a whole range of distractions that we involve ourselves in, and the whole purpose, if we stand back and ask ourselves why, the whole purpose is to distract us. Usually it's from emotional pain. Usually it's from engaging, relating with people at a level that's intimate and meaningful. We do it to numb our pain. We do it so we don't have to have that difficult conversation. And they become habits in our life. Work can be a distraction. Get this. You can actually turn something godly into a distraction. Let me tell you some distractions I've used in my life. And I think I've mentioned this before. I used to read, or I still do to an extent, I used to read lots of theology books. And I studied theology. I got a degree in theology. Well, I had to read theology books. But I used to read so many. And the purpose was to fill my mind, give me more information. But if I'm honest with myself, a lot of the time I was reading them so I didn't have to deal with what was going in my soul. I had sin in my life, unrepented sin in my life, that every time I attempted to get alone with God, I could not bear it, and so I would start to read. Because it was so painful to confront. So I would distract myself with something religious, something that looked good from the outside. But if I was honest with myself, it was a distraction. It was distracting me from growing in God. And so we can convince ourselves that we're doing something godly, but it's not. It can just be a distraction. It can keep us from entering into that place of solitude with God. Here's the next part I wanted to talk about, which is silence. Silence makes solitude a reality. This is a quote from Henry Nouwen, who was, he's actually a Catholic, he's dead now, but he was a Catholic theologian, and he would write a lot and talk a lot about spiritual transformation. And I think that quote from him is really on the money. Silence makes solitude a reality. To have real solitude, you have to stop talking. We can be alone but have constant internal dialogue. So it's not just talking outward, it's talking inward. How many times do you attempt to just be alone with God, even to read the Bible, and you find this conversation going on in your head, which has got nothing to do with what you're reading? That's internal dialogue. It's very hard to hear the voice of God when all you can hear is your own voice, or these imaginary conversations you're having with someone else. So what is silence? Silence is the practice of not speaking, both externally and internally. Silence teaches us to listen, observe, and pay attention. I have to say, I didn't really experience internal silence for most of my life. Actually, when I was a lot younger and I struggled a lot with, obvious anxiety, I would constantly have dialogue in my head. I'd constantly be talking to myself. Constantly. It decreased over many years, but I was never truly free of it. It wasn't actually till I did soul care that I experienced freedom from it. And, I could fall back into that easily, and sometimes I do. So I'm not saying I've eradicated it fully from my life, but it wasn't till, actually, it was probably, soul care and getting deliverance, both those two things together. But, the freedom I experienced, this new way of living, to be able to sit there and not be overwhelmed with my internal dialogue. It was like a completely different life. It's just a completely different way to live. Silence trains us to silence our inner dialogue so we can hear God. We all want to hear God, but usually our voice is too loud to hear God's voice. This is a quote from Dallas Willard from his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. He says, "Why do we insist on talking as much as we do? Because we are inwardly uneasy about what others think of us. We use words to adjust our appearance and elicit their approval. We fear our virtues might not receive adequate appreciation, and our shortcomings might not be properly understood." How much of our talk, how much of our engagement of talking to other people is about adjusting our image of ourselves to them? We're saying things to impress people, or saying things so that they won't judge us so much. This constant adjustment of our image, our outward image to other people. Proverbs 10:19, I think a lot of people would know this scripture. When there are many words, sin is unavoidable, but the one who controls his lips is prudent. If we talk a lot, it is inevitable that we will sin with our mouth a lot. If we talk a lot, we will sin with our mouth a lot. Now, there's other things. You can be a quiet person and not talk much, but you can have lots of sin. You can sin with your mind. You can judge people without saying anything. So I'm not saying sin doesn't occur outside of talking, but I tell you, if you talk a lot, you will sin with your mouth a lot. Gossip must be the biggest sin in the church. Gossip. Gossip is talking about someone instead of talking to someone. Gossip. That must be the biggest sin in the church. It's done with the mouth. It's probably the most destructive sin in the church. Slander, complaining, they're also sins with our mouth. When we talk a lot, it will just come out. So we need to be conscious of what's coming out of our mouth. We need to learn the ability to be silent, to be able to process things internally and not have to speak them out. Because often when we speak, we all struggle with certain thoughts, but as soon as we speak them out, often, what's in our heart then is manifest outwardly, and then we are seeing the fruit. We will see the fruit of our sin. Let me tell you, let me address the issue of gossip. Do you know how to deal with gossip in your life? Every time you gossip about someone, that is, talk about someone instead of, and obviously it's a negative. You talk positively about people, that's not gossip. Every time you gossip, whoever you've gossiped to, go and apologize to them. Go and confess your sin to them. You do that 2 or 3 times, you'll stop gossiping. Do you know how humbling it is to go to someone and say, look, I just need to confess a sin to you. I gossiped about that person. I just want to say, I'm sorry, that was wrong of me. I should not have done that. Please forgive me. That's what we should do. If you do that, if you do that a few times, you will stop gossiping. Because every time you're tempted to gossip, you'll remember, I'm going to have to come back and clean this mess up. And the same thing, if you allow people to gossip to you and you sit there and listen, that can also be sinful. You need to be able to say, hey, look, I don't think you should be talking about them. I think you should need to be talking directly to them. We need to be people that other people know. You can't go and gossip to that person because they're actually going to point out that that's wrong. The church needs to be a safe place for relationships. So simple things like that are important because we need to create safety. We need to be able to trust one another. We need to have the courage to go and talk to other people directly rather than talk about them to other people. And we need to be accountable to one another with that. And we need to, in the appropriate way, we need to actually say to people, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be complaining. You need to go to that person and talk to them directly. I tell you, if you do that, man, the power that you have, the spiritual authority that will increase in your life, if you are able to control and discipline your mouth, I tell you, God will use your mouth to bring deliverance, to bring healing, to bring blessing to other people, because out of one side of your mouth, you're not speaking evil. You're speaking, what's coming out of your mouth is going to be used for God to bring blessing. But while we're cursing someone with our mouth, we cannot bless them. We need to learn the ability to process our difficulties with God. And oftentimes it's looking at ourselves first rather than judging other people. Putting ourselves before God and saying, Lord, shine your light on me. Here's one thing I'm convinced about. We cannot change other people. You can't do it. You can only change yourself. You only have the ability to change yourself. And do you know what? The more you're changing, the more you're growing, the more you can walk alongside someone and help them to change. You can't change them. They have to make their own decisions, their own choices. But you can support them. You can encourage them. You can build a trust relationship where you can speak truth into their life and they can open up and be honest with you and confessional. You can build intimacy with that person. And you do that by learning to control your mouth. Learning to speak wisdom instead of cursing. Learning to speak encouragement instead of discouragement. You know, love has to be outworked. We do that often with our mouth. We need to learn to love people well. When was the last time you actually encouraged someone? You said something positive. That's our build. Everyone needs encouragement. Here's another quote from Dallas Willard. The more I practice silence, the less I become skeptical and judgmental. The more I learn to accept the things I didn't like about others, the more I accept them as uniquely created in the image of God. The less I talk, the fuller the words spoken at the appropriate time. The more I value others, the more I serve them in small ways, the more I enjoy and celebrate life. The discipline of silence. The purpose of solitude and silence is to see and hear. It's a container. It's a container. It's a place where we go to receive the revelation from God. To contain that revelation. To feed on that revelation. To allow that revelation to go deep into our soul. Think of these words spoken by Jesus through the Gospels. Do you not have eyes? Do you not have eyes and not see? Do you not have ears and not hear? Let anyone who has ears listen. Blessed are your eyes because they do see, and your ears because they do hear. Do you remember those phrases that Jesus used? He uses one of them often, let anyone who has ears listen. He uses that often in the parables. What he's saying is, Do you have spiritual ears to hear? I mean, obviously everyone in front of him had ears. Everyone in front of him had eyes, so they could see and hear, but he's talking spiritually. And he's saying, do you have spiritual ears to hear and spiritual eyes to see? Solitude and silence gives us the spiritual seeing and the spiritual hearing. Some questions for you to consider, all of us to consider. How are you distracting yourself? How are you distracting yourself? What is your preferred method of distraction? Because this is what's stopping you from engaging in solitude and silence. What do you do instead of being alone with God? Why are you afraid of solitude and silence? Why are you afraid to be alone with God and just sit there with nothing? Not your mobile phone, not a book. Just sit there and allow God to speak to your heart. For me, it used to be, not anymore, but it used to be unconfessed sin. Maybe God's spoken to you and said, I want you to go and confess your sin to someone. Maybe it's an idol. Maybe there's some idol in your life that you don't want to give up. That every time you're alone with God, he brings that to your attention. No, I can't go there, God. So you distract yourself. Why are you afraid of solitude and silence? What's stopping us from going to that place? And thirdly and lastly, how can you start practicing the spiritual disciplines? How can you start practicing? So this is the fourth one. First one I talked about prayer. Second one I talked about reading and meditating on the Bible. Third one I talked about sacrifice. Today I'm talking about solitude and silence. How can you start practicing? Have you started practicing any of those? How can you start? If you haven't, how can you start? What do you need to adjust in your lifestyle to make space to practice them? Because that's the whole point of me teaching on them, is so we practice them, not just to understand them. Understanding them won't help you. It's actually practicing them. And here's the thing, it's hard. It is hard. And it's not like you can start them all at once. You got to start somewhere. Just start one. Just start to do one. Just start to make space for one. Start to get on the road. Start to get moving. And as you get moving, God will give you more grace and enablement to do more. And as you know what happens when you start to see the benefit, you desire to do it more. You go, oh man, why didn't I do this earlier? So let me just finish in prayer. Father, I thank you for